so we don't forget. So the NET project and the NET program at the center provides technical assistance to Perkins grantees who are receive grants from the New York State Education Department to provide CTE programming and support students in their CTE journey. And so our role in that is to assist you and provide technical assistance to all of you in recruitment and retention of students who are pursuing gender non-traditional CTE fields of study. And so we have all our services are free to you. And we encourage you to call on us when you are having any issues or in need of assistance with any of your work. And today is a very exciting webinar because we have an incredible speaker that I will introduce in a second. But the purpose of the webinar is to really discuss recruitment in depth, recruitment of CTE students in general, but specifically CTE students who are pursuing fields of study that are non-traditional for their gender. And these are defined as fields of study where there is less than 25% of either gender. So our speaker today will help us grapple with the issues that we face. She is definitely a distinguished researcher in the field and will share with us some of the findings of her research. She will share with us the importance of framing and messaging when it comes to recruiting students and the strategies that are believed to help institutions reach more diverse prospective students and dispel some of the myths about gender non-traditional CTE. So I am pleased and honored to introduce Brittany Davidson, who is currently the principal with the ADA Center, which specializes in helping institutions to better leverage technology for student success. Brittany leads the ADA Center's advising technology and workforce research. She works with partners, including Achieving the Dream, Jobs for the Future, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, various access-focused institutions, and state educational system. And Brittany's career has really focused on a wide variety of challenges that face institutions in providing access to students. She led projects and workshops aiming at helping community colleges develop robust employer partnerships and drive strong labor market outcomes for students. And she is the author of really important pieces of work. One is the Workforce Playbook, which is a community college guide to delivering excellent career and technical education and aligning talent and opportunities. So while today we focus on recruitment, Brittany is certainly an expert in also retention, and she'll discuss how these two really efforts are not really separate from each other, but are intertwined. And really thrilled to have Brittany here. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Brittany to educate us all on what her research findings have informed us. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to put them on the chat or save them for when Brittany finishes her presentation, and we'll all engage in a great discussion on the topics that we tackled. So Brittany, the floor is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you for that warm and extensive introduction. It was lovely to hear all of those things and lovely to be with all of you today. Thank you to all of you for attending. I know it is June, and I know many of you are in New York currently. I am in New York, and I know the weather is just turned lovely. So appreciate you being with us today. I'm going to go ahead and do the hardest part of this presentation and try to share my screen, which I feel like is always, for some reason, the most
It's always
it's
tricky.
always the most nerve-wracking. So let's see if we can do this. There we go. All righty. Is everyone able to see? Yes? Looks great. Great. So I think that I've already had a pretty good introduction. But just for those of you who are a little less familiar with the ADA Center, like was said, we support a lot of national initiatives. We will advise the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on some of their post-secondary tech initiatives. We develop a lot of research-based resources that are open source and available to all of you, and I'll touch on some of those today. And we also work directly with colleges and states in need of technology strategy support. But I'd say underlying all of this, the thing that I do want to emphasize is that we are founded on the belief that technology is not a silver bullet to any problem when it comes to recruitment, admissions, retention, what have you. However, as I think we have seen, especially post 2020, when it comes to our strategies and when it comes to kind of bringing in next generation strategies to our recruitment and admissions efforts, technology can be a very useful tool if it's used well. So I myself am very excited about this particular webinar. I was a teacher in the past. I have also worked in ed tech, so understand what it is to be a woman in STEM, and have really dedicated my research career to understanding how education can be a lever for equity and economic opportunity. So like was mentioned, I think a lot of the research I'll be pulling in here today has to do with my background in ed tech, but also my background in traversing the country for the workforce playbook and getting to talk to hundreds of students and tons of practitioners, ed tech vendors, folks who are likely in your shoes as well. So just to touch on sort of where is all of the research coming from? A lot of the stuff today will be coming from some targeted prospect focus groups that I've conducted. So these were groups that we did with folks who would have really benefited from CTE education. So these are folks who are unemployed, underemployed, opportunity youth, people who are, young people who are not in school and not working, folks who we typically want to target, but for some reason had decided they did not want to enroll. So we actually pulled those people and said, tell us a little bit about why you chose not to go into these programs. Tell us a little bit more about the specific words, phrases, messages that resonate and don't with you. We've also done a lot of research with current students to understand how they made their decisions about programs, what influenced them, and what resources were most useful as they were thinking about what programs to enter. And I've also done a lot of work talking to practitioners, folks who were really adept at recruiting diverse students, whether that be for gender non-traditional programs, but also thinking about race, ethnicity, and age, as well as vendors who are working with them to create the technology ecosystems to help them do some of that more advanced work. So that's where it's all coming from. Now, granted, any of those questions could be a webinar on its own. So here's the plan I have for you today. We're going to touch very briefly on kind of the quick snapshot of what research tells us about effective, what we're calling next generation recruitment. So what does that mean when it comes to our more diverse prospects, people going into gender non-traditional fields? How might we need to think differently about admissions and recruitment in general? And those are themes that will carry throughout the rest of the webinar, where I've kind of divided up the research into one, the who. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about strategies around thinking about who we are trying to talk to when we talk about recruiting non-traditional prospects. The what. So what is it that we need to be saying to them? So a little bit of that framing and messaging. And finally, the how. And this is where we'll get into, I think a lot of the things that we'll talk about in the who and the what might seem a little overwhelming. And then we'll be like, well, how do I actually do that? I wear many hats in my day-to-day. And so I'll talk you through how we've seen some of the more effective practitioners do this in their practice. I'll leave off with a few final resources. There's clearly not enough time in the day for me to go into all of the research that we've done, that can point you in the direction of some of the playbooks and resources that are open source that you can download. And then hopefully we will have some time for Q&A. Quick note, I know that we mentioned you can ask questions throughout, definitely do that. I am not great at monitoring my chat box while also thinking of the next thing I need to say. So I'll rely on Esther and friends to let me know if anything comes up. So quick snapshots. What is the difference between what we call kind of the traditional versus the next gen way of thinking about recruitment and admissions? Traditionally, so when we kind of traverse the country and we talk to folks who are either struggling with admissions and recruitment and folks who have really figured it out, we've noticed a few key differences. So for one, from the traditional angle, what a lot of folks will do is maximize existing prospects and prospect pipelines. So they're focusing on a targeted individual, just themselves, who is the person we need to enroll, and maybe they have kind of very broad segments that they're focused on. The materials and strategies are geared for that kind of general prospect outreach. People who are kind of in that next generation bucket are starting to think about new or more inclusive pipelines by understanding more holistic prospect needs. So they're leveraging data to understand who's currently not being served in the community and why. And they're also understanding a bit more, not just about the prospect themselves, the person you are trying to get into enroll, but the people around them. We know from a lot of non-traditional students and people who are entering fields where historically there have not been a lot of people who look like them, influencers matter. And so people in recruitment admissions who are kind of next gen are thinking also about the messaging and the work that needs to go into the village around the prospect they are trying to recruit. Two, traditionally, institutions will think of admissions and recruitment, I think this was alluded to earlier, as a discrete activity. It is something that starts with outreach and ends with, if successful, with enrollment. I would say people who are moving towards that next generation version are really thinking about how recruitment connects to student success and retention. They understand that insights about your prospects that you are getting throughout that outreach and admissions process can be incredibly valuable in informing program evolution and improvement. And they understand that recruitment really does depend on the program quality itself. Your current students are your future employers. They're your future hiring managers. They're your recruiters, and they are one of the #1 influencers for future prospects as well. And three, traditionally, we use broad messaging. It's a little bit more one size fits all. Next generation, we see folks using tools like CRMs to develop more customized methods to be able to kind of achieve that more customized messaging and marketing that you need for #1 and #2. So inclusive pipelines, new pipelines, and specific messaging. So kind of 3 themes there that we'll touch on as we move throughout the webinar, but just wanted to kind of give you the overview. I'll call back to these a few times as we go throughout so you can see in practice what that looks like. But just some things to think in mind. And as you kind of think about where you fall on that spectrum, nobody is perfect. Not everybody is going to do all of these things at once. And you are not a bad recruiter or a bad admissions person if you don't have, you kind of fall more towards the traditional. It really does take a lot of work and a lot of, I think, collaboration across the institution to move from more traditional into that new next gen way of doing things. But just kind of good to know the framing as you're starting. So diving in on the who. So when the NET folks asked me to do this webinar, there are a few things that I was thinking about when it came to recruitment of non-traditional students. So I've had a lot of conversations with folks who have, for example, recruited females into welding, males into nursing, that kind of thing. But for one, recruiting students into gender non-traditional programs, the advice that comes with that tends to be really broad if you're talking about programs in general, right? I think that most of the folks on the line today and who are watching this, you probably already know a lot of the general information about that, right? We know that what the stereotypes are. We know the importance of having people in leadership positions who look like the students you are trying to recruit. Beyond that, it can get a little specific, right? So I think that obviously there are different nuances to recruiting, like I said before, a male into nursing or a female into welding or something like that. It starts to get really program specific. So as I'm thinking and talking to you all about what is the value that you can take out of this research that is new and different from what you might already know, the thing that we see a lot of admissions folks doing who are on the cutting edge is they're not just thinking about gender in a silo. They're thinking about the broader question, who's not here, and considering which women and men are the hardest to reach and who are not enrolling in college at all, right? So we're not just trying to enroll the people we always enroll. So going back to that first kind of piece about new pipelines, we are thinking about the people in our communities who are not yet here. And nationally, these are a few statistics. We know that there are about 5 million, what we would consider opportunity youth. That's young adults 16 to 24 who are not in school and not working. Definitely folks who could do well with a CTE program. Even with the recent uptick in employment, I know we've all been watching the jobs report, the economy is super weird right now. There are still about 6 million unemployed adults who are currently not a part of the US workforce, and 41 million underemployed adults. So that's people earning less than $12 an hour. So jobs that, they could be doing a lot better if they got a little bit more education and can move into higher demand, higher wage roles. Now, keeping all of those people in mind, all of those people have intersectional identities, right? There are men and women who make those up. Gender is one of them. But when we think about who isn't here, it's vital to think about the other factors that are going to intersect and correlate with gender that are going to influence why we make certain decisions about whether we enroll at all or enroll in a certain program. And so let me talk to you a little bit about what that means. So when we're doing interviews with folks, we're trying to understand, specifically, we work with the Siemens Foundation. Siemens, as a STEM employer, was interested in getting more non-traditional people in their workforce as well. So we did some in-depth interviews with some of these folks. And there was one woman who would be considered opportunity youth. She was 19. And we were trying to talk to her a little bit about an IT program and understand kind of why she was hesitant to enroll in that program. And, one of the kind of first layers that you might hear about from her is something like, well, I'm not good at math. And those of us who are kind of familiar with this space know that that is kind of a general stereotype. We know that this is a barrier for a lot of women going into STEM. However, as you talk to her further, we say, well, why? What are some of the reasons you think this? And she says, well, I went to community college once before, and they made me take some tests. I didn't get to study, I just took it. It said I was bad at math, and so I had to take this basic math class and pay for it. And I'm like, why am I doing this? This isn't what I came here to study, right? And so now we're kind of thinking, oh, it's not just that she doesn't think she's good at math because she is a woman and we've been taught those things, but it's because she's actually encountered some barriers at the school itself. We ask a little further and we find out, oh, the biggest barrier is I work part-time to help support my grandma. I'm the best one at taking care of her. My brothers love them, kind of whatever is what she said. I'm all for making more money, but you need that time to go to school, and I got to know it's going to be worth it. I don't want debt. And those math classes, that wasn't helping to put food on the table, right? So we think about this woman and we think about, the typical things we do to try to encourage women to go into STEM. We might think about the student and we might try a bunch of messaging that says, all about girls being good at math, combating that stereotype. And that is really important, but it is not sufficient for this student. This student is going to need us to think more about who she is as a whole person and things like the fact that she is also a primary caretaker in her home and the fact that she has had an experience with community colleges before that was not the most encouraging. So really thinking more holistically about the who. Who are we trying to attract? Who is missing? Why are they missing? So strategy number one, to kind of make this really practical for those of you thinking about putting this into practice, is to gather your data. With schools who have done this effectively, and I'll give you a case study in just a moment, they're going to start by looking at program data, institution data, and regional data. And they're going to think about how do our student population demographics compare to our region, to the demographics of opportunity youth, to the unemployed? How do our program demographics specifically compare to those things? And what might be intersecting with gender to create some of those barriers? Consider disaggregating where you can by age, race, ethnicity, and gender. We do need to consider intersectionality as we think about our who. Now, to give you a sense of how a college did this really effectively, I'll talk to you a bit about Valencia College in Orlando, Florida. They're one of the folks that I visited and we studied in depth for the workforce playbook. And they, similar to kind of what I'm telling you now, started with their who. So they said, who needs more skills training or education to move up the economic ladder? They also said, okay, of those people, who are the ones we are not currently reaching? And what are the labor market opportunities we could potentially pair them with? They look at their data and they found that, okay, we've got K-12 graduates who obviously need more education to move up. We've got about 13,000 of those who are getting pumped into our system every year. However, there are over 100,000 low-income adults in our region who are also currently not being served. That is almost 10 times the amount of the K-12 graduates. And all of their recruitment efforts at the time were really focused on the K-12 pipeline alone. And so they realized, oh, we actually need to expand and look into other pipelines that are actually much bigger. There's a much bigger need there. And so what they did is they kind of took some of their faculty who already had some skills in CTE and created the Accelerated Skills Training Program, which is a program that is mapped to industry credentials that offer living wages. They worked with employers to design it, and they designed it to be fairly short-term, delivered throughout the community. Some of them could stack into longer-term associate's degrees as well. And then overall, they were able to reach 600 low-income adults per year. And that was, I think, as of 2022. And they have a 92% completion rate. Their president says, we really need to understand that we have to address the whole economic ladder. And in doing so, we can reach all kinds of people we otherwise would. Now, you might look at this and say, well, what does this have to do with gender? Well, as they continue to grow the program, they've increasingly been able to think about how it applies and appeals to female students, right? So this is a page from their website. And you'll notice that they are really trying to focus on women getting into these accelerated studies, which are largely in male-dominated fields. And as you look at their success stories that they highlight, one of the people they highlight is the student Iris, who is a single mother, right? Why does that matter? Well, that matters because the design of the program and the kinds of things they emphasized through it are all about that kind of being able to get through it in a short amount of time, being able to make it work with your life. Iris was able to eventually get her associates in supervision and management after completing welding 1 and welding 2. And this really matters because if you think about the who, Iris is one anecdote that represents a much larger population. Nationally, 1 in 5 college students are currently raising children while attending school. Of those, 80% of them are female. And so when we think about how do we recruit more non-traditional gendered students into some of these roles, well, what do they need? If you have a population that's female that is going to be a caretaker in a lot of sense of the world, how do you make sure that your program fits those needs? And so this is a really excellent example of how they were able to do that. So now we've talked a little bit about the who. I want to talk a little bit more now about the what. So if we understand who's missing, you've done some of your data analysis, you understand a little bit more about which men or which women specifically you want to target through your recruitment. How do you come up with messaging that's going to be really compelling for who those people are and what their needs are? So in our research, I mentioned we've done focus groups across the country. And this was actually one of my favorite activities. And I have the methodology here because I think it's actually, if you have the chance to do focus groups or you run focus groups at your institution, I think this is a really interesting way to look at language. Some of you might already do it this way, but what we did is we took program descriptions for CTE programs from across the country, and we had hundreds of respondents highlight words from those program descriptions that resonated with them, and they were asked to cross out words that did not. We looked across all of that data, and we assessed which words and which messages had the most positive and the most negative connotation across those target groups. From there, we kind of took that information and developed new messaging, kind of revised some of those program descriptions, and had kind of a new group of those people force rank their favorites and test out to see whether or not the old versus the new messaging mattered. And it turns out, research shows messaging matters. So you see, we saw most double-digit increases across the board in terms of program interest when using effective language. So the question here is, what was the effective language? And drum roll, it's a little bit of a complex thing, right? Because the most effective messaging was 1, return on investment, and 2, program feasibility. So return on investment, things that spoke to people who were uncertain about the return on their investment if they decided to go back to school. So the sample messages contained themes like, you're worth the investment, which you can tell kind of has the undertone of ROI, but also a little bit of that confidence building in there too. Message 2 that tested the highest was feasibility. So any kind of messaging around how this program would be feasible for a busy working adult or somebody who's a caretaker, basically anyone who has something going on outside of school and believes that they can attend school and still kind of do those things. And so the sample messaging was something along the lines of programs that fit your life. That's kind of the theme. You take that foundational messaging and then, of course, you pair it with an understanding of how to overcome stereotypes. So you might have an ROI message or a feasibility message paired with having it come from a student who looks like me, right? So in the last Valencia example, we had all of that messaging about new skills training and some of the feasibility of that program paired with a case study, a success story of a single mom who has gone through that program, right? So looking at this, I wanted to come back and kind of zoom in on a few things here. Gain skills fast, get hired faster, really effective, clean messaging. And a few things that I wanted to do from like the ADA Center perspective on what makes this website particularly effective. A little background, the ADA Center has done about 50 in-depth student interviews to explore how students are using technology post-2020 to think about decisions when it comes to programs, when it comes to enrollment, all that kind of stuff. And the website is increasingly critical to informing how students choose their college and their program. And so many of them expect to be able to find the information they need from a page within 2 clicks. Most college websites that we go to, and we'll do audits of these when we work with colleges, sometimes the information they're looking for is 4 or 5 clicks deep. So it's a good little test to do on your own program website or your main page to see, what's the most important thing our students care about based on our focus groups or our research. Can I actually get to it from my website in that amount of clicks? Anyway, so what works about this one is, one, it's a dedicated page. This is a dedicated page for accelerated skills training for women, right? It shows that they are prioritizing that group. It has a prominent photo of someone who is female. They have the proven persuasive language built in. They have those case studies I shared earlier to encourage belonging. And they have an easy call to action right here. Get started today. There's not 5 different buttons. It's really clean. Students really appreciate that. So kind of the execution of that is really important too. Other things you can think about. So you might be thinking, well, I'm not going to create a whole new program that's 10 weeks. I'm an admissions director. I can't do that. So things to generally think about that could be effective for your own messaging, for your programs that received high or very high interest from the prospects that we talk to, are things like you will receive hands-on job training, you have options where and when you take classes, grants, financial aid, that kind of thing that talks about keeping costs manageable, working well in school, free transportation, childcare, and other conveniences, right? A couple ideas to think about. Some of them might be related to your program, others might be related more to the supports that your institution does offer. The percentages here show what percentage of those surveyed rated those things as their number 1 or number 2 item. So pretty high. So that takes us to strategy number 2, which is check your program. So consider, what are the specific attributes that make your program attractive to your prospective students, given what you know from number 1 about who they are. That could include unique program design elements. So maybe, are they fast? Are they hybrid? Are some of the courses online that make it feasible for your student to make CTE work with their life? And the other thing is data on strong program outcomes. Students want to know, am I going to complete? Am I going to be employed? And are those wages from going through this program going to make this program worth it? Considering your demographics, again, you'll want to augment how you deliver the message or who it comes from in a way that encourages those prospective students to feel a sense of belonging. So I've seen folks do this through, there's a Mariner program in San Jacinto College that has a female lead of that department, and she is front and center on a lot of their recruitment messaging. She works very closely with their admissions team, right? So thinking about how to combine message with messenger as you're doing that. Now, I do want to pause here because one of the questions that I often get when I'm doing these presentations and talking about the workforce playbook is, well, what if we don't have strong outcomes? And can we just highlight the stuff that's good and leave out the stuff that's bad? And I really want to push you to, I advise very strongly against this. And here's why. So this is a story about Susan. Susan is not her real name. We use a pseudonym for this, but her story is not unique. We heard this over and over and over again on the road, and I continue to hear it from current students today. But her specific story is she was a single mom, 28 years old, and she went to a college and said, she was already decided on her program. She said, I want to do cosmetology. My friend does it. It seems fun. She got signed up. They enrolled her. Everything seemed great. She actually did end up completing the program. But if we had dug a little deeper, we would know that what she actually cares about is security and stability for herself and her child, number one. She wants to help people. She cares about the cost of the program. She cares about maintaining income while in school. Now, on the surface, cosmetology, it checked a few of those boxes, right? It wasn't super expensive. It was fun. She's helping people, but it did not check her number one, which was that it did not provide security and stability for herself and for her child. Because when she came out and we were interviewing her, she said, I didn't know you had to buy your own tools, find your own clients. I wasn't turning a real profit for years. I ended up having to take other odd jobs. That's not why I went back to school. I've talked to people about this, and some will say, well, she should have known better. It's really on the student to really know what they're getting into. And to some extent, sure, like that's true. We are all responsible for our own decisions in certain ways. However, I would keep in mind, particularly for first generation students, the number one place where they get their information about careers and career pathways is from family and friends. And these are not always the most factual sources, right? So she signed up for cosmetology because she had seen it offhand, her friend was doing it. She could have gone into another program that would have met her needs better. And then, and this is the kicker, she would have been able to come back into her community where she is surrounded by other people who have not yet gone to college, do not have a lot of exposure to higher education. And she would have been a good advocate for CTE programs and for higher education. Because of this experience, she was back in the community and she was in a focus group actually when we were watching her, and she was telling everyone in that room, do not trust X college. This is a specific college she went to, and we were in that region. She's like, everything they do is a scam. They just want your money. Like, I'm worse off than I was. And what kind of message is this to send to people who, there are opportunity youth in that room? Certainly she's got her own child. So you have to really think about when you recruit a student, their experience will directly impact not only them, but the people in their network. So in this case, it really was impacting her community, who she's talking to. She's part of her church. She's talking to people there. And ultimately, it impacts the program and the institution as well. So when you think about your program outcomes, it is really important that we're honest about them. And we're honest with students about what it takes to succeed. There are a lot of different ways this could have gone. Somebody could have had a conversation with Susan about the fact that you have to get your own tools, about the fact that you have to generate your own clients. Perhaps there could have been something in the program to teach her some of those marketing skills. So when she got out there, she could do it. Or just a little bit more information up front about the array of programs available at the college and some that might be a better fit for her goals. Either way, we really like to advocate for that candor and transparency up front. And when it comes to outcomes, certainly we can talk maybe in the Q&A a little bit more about how you deal with outcomes that maybe aren't as good, but certainly not worth it to hide those from students in the long term. All right, so finally getting into the how. So what tools can be used to support diverse student enrollment? There are a lot of tools out there, and certainly they vary depending on the institution itself. Certainly there are institutions that are smaller and can therefore, there's faculty who know every single student in their program, and so there's a lot of hands-on getting to know you. Institutions that are larger obviously don't have that luxury, but they might have a little bit more budget to spend on staff or on tools. So there's a wide variety. There's also a wide variety of technologies that can be used. I've seen ecosystems that kind of run the gamut when it comes to recruitment and admissions. But the thing I'm going to talk about today, because I think it is sort of one of the buzzier words in higher ed right now, is CRM. So this is something that we hear a lot of institutions talking about in a lot of different ways. And so I just wanted to use the last part of our time together to talk a little bit more about what is a CRM and what are some of the best use cases for how it can be used for diverse student recruitment. So just to start off, when the ADA Center works with institutions that are considering a CRM and kind of dealing with these issues of diverse student recruitment, this is typically what we hear. And so maybe you'll identify with some of these. But we'll hear things like, okay, in our current process, admissions, admin, student support, everyone is capturing student interaction and communication differently. We have stuff in a student information system, there's stuff in an advising software, there's stuff in an Excel document. We go to these recruitment events, we write things down on sign-in sheets on pieces of paper, or we might have an Excel sign-in, or maybe there's this one recruiter who just likes to take things on pen and paper in her little notebook, but all that information is fairly scattered. Then what happens? Well, for one, you lose insights. So perhaps, like I said, you get a lot of really rich information about prospects at that stage of recruitment. So you might hear, for example, from a student that they want to go into welding, however, they're going to need childcare for part of the day. And you know that there is some childcare support on campus. You jot it down in your little notebook, you send the student an email about it, maybe they get admitted, but later on, as they're going into the college, they've forgotten about your email. And because that insight about them needing childcare is not stored in a centralized location, their advisor doesn't know that, right? And so maybe it doesn't connect them with that resource. Information silos, so unable to effectively access holistic student information across the student life cycle. So again, perhaps you know something that advising should know, perhaps a faculty member knows something that you should know, so on and so forth. And finally, another challenge is that you end up with communication and outreach that is a lot more one size fits all instead of really customized. So it's really hard to coordinate and to be able to do some of these things I was talking about. So being able to send some of that messaging that's more catered to a student need becomes really hard if all you have is kind of one tool to do it, one major listserv or something like that. So what happens to our students when we have all these challenges? For one, they get confused, they make mistakes, sometimes during the admissions process that throws them off track. Maybe they don't enroll. Or maybe they're just getting pinged with a ton of emails that are just kind of general, and they miss updates and information that's more relevant to them and their specific needs. And sometimes if they get too overloaded, one of the biggest complaints we hear from colleges is my students just don't read email. My students just keep deleting my texts. Well, that's because they're getting overwhelmed and it's not super coordinated. And so what happens then is the student might disconnect from the college or the community. So how do we avoid this? A lot of folks have been turning to CRM technologies as a means to help to correct this process. Now, I'm not here to say that CRM is, and I will never say that any technology is a silver bullet. I have seen these implemented terribly, and I've seen these implemented really, really well. It kind of all comes down to the details of implementation and procurement. But for us, I wanted to first clear up what do we mean by CRM. CRMs have been used in other sectors for years. Certainly, if you've ever, tried to shop for something on Amazon, you put it in your cart, and then later on you forget about it. You get an email that says, "Hey, you forgot to buy this item." Your name is somewhere in a CRM, right? So Amazon will use it. Any of our retailers will use it to contact us. Colleges are a little bit newer. There's a couple different ones on the market. There's not one that rules them all yet. And most vendors who will tell you that they have a CRM that can manage end-to-end, that's usually not entirely true. They might be able to do some things end-to-end, but the functionality will be limited. The main categories kind of fall here. So for us, admissions and recruitment, there are a number of pipeline or prospect management CRMs. So things like, if you're familiar with Slate, with TargetX or Liaison, these are tools that are going to track your prospective students, create marketing campaigns, they can monitor applications, you can start to analyze data to see what kind of messaging is working and what isn't. You can keep notes on things a student might need. So for example, if your female student is a parent, or if your male student is interested in nursing but wants to talk to a faculty member that is male and in the nursing field, you can keep track of that. Other CRMs are kind of more case management platforms. So if you all have heard of things like EAB Navigate, things like Aviso, Anthology. Those are ones that are meant for enrolled students and will kind of do some of your things like flag when students go off path, we'll have academic plans, all that kind of stuff. Sometimes these can connect. Oftentimes that is pretty complicated. And we can talk about that in Q&A if you want. But typically those are the kind of church and state aspects of CRMs today in higher ed. There are also CRMs that can manage partners. So in recruitment, sometimes I've seen admissions folks who also like to keep track of employer leads. So employers who can maybe have employees who are interested in programs and things like that. And those are actually somewhat similar to the pipeline management CRMs as well. Most of you, I think, should be fairly familiar with what a prospect pipeline management CRM is, but typically this is what it might look like at a very high level. You'll be able to keep track of your campaigns, how many people you've contacted, what applications are open, which ones are started, and which ones are submitted. Like for Andrea Carey, you might be able to keep track of the fact that she is a parent, that she speaks English, but also Spanish, and other things like that that can help you to cater your messaging to her. Some of these tools will also include a user interface for the prospect themselves as well, which can be useful for helping to keep the prospect on track, but not all of them. It's really important if you either have one of these systems or are thinking about procuring them to really do your due diligence on the vendor. Do not just believe the demo that you see. We have a lot of resources around what questions to ask vendors about these things and how to really probe in your RFP to make sure that you get what you need. But really be careful about kind of what you buy and really ask questions about the different features that come included versus what you might need to pay extra for. But anyway, that is the kind of high level prospect pipeline management tool that can be used to do some of this stuff that we've been talking about. So specifically, I'll give you a sense of how we pull it all together. So we talked about the fact that we need to understand who our students are, who's missing. We need to know a little bit more about them so we can cater our messaging in a way that works. And then we need to get the tools in place to allow us to execute on that strategy. And Western Connecticut State University is an institution that did that really, really well. Not specifically for gender, but they did do it for Latinx students and for Black students. And it has a similar kind of strategy cadence to what we've been talking about. So the story here is around 2012, WCSU was experiencing an enrollment decline. And they had very, very dated systems. They had about 5,000 students, 35% of them were Pell eligible. Only 13% were Latino and 11% were Black. And they knew by looking at data from their region that they were missing a lot of those other Latino and Black students. And they said, you know, for the purposes of equity, as a part of our new equity plan, we need to really make sure we are increasing access for historically marginalized and minoritized populations. And so they turned to Jay Murray, who is their AVP of Enrollment Management. And Jay took a look around and said, look, we are using legacy tools with a one-size-fits-all functionality. We're sending the same message to everyone over and over and over again, and they're deleting us. That doesn't work. There is an enormous variation in terms of the communication preferences of students and how they engage during the enrollment process. A first-generation Latina student isn't the same as a white student whose parents went here, right? Now, specifically, as Jay was doing his research, he realized that for many of his Latino students, for example, a lot of them were high school age. So he knew that the age group was roughly about 18 to 20. And he knew that a lot of them, you know, talking about the village, were very influenced by their parents. The other thing he knew was that these prospects' parents do not necessarily look at email so much as they look at hard mail. So actual letters in the mail, right? From doing his research. So he knew that he needed a tool that could address both of these things. And so he went to his institution and kind of speaking to our second theme, which was around the fact that admissions and recruitment at these next gen schools does not operate as a silo. So Jay knew he could not operate as a silo. So he brought together his president to really understand their equity goals, the IT department, so he could understand the tools that he might need, and faculty and student affairs and support services, so we could understand the relative value of different programs and supports the institution offered. They were able to procure something called Target X Liaisons Recruitment Suite. good tool. I mean, there's a lot of other ones out there. I wouldn't say this is what they did. You must have this tool too. There's a lot of others out there, but that's just what they did. And it included things like recruitment event management, multimodal communication, a student-facing piece, as well as some sort of data analysis so you could track how well his efforts were going. But of course, like I said before, technology is not a silver bullet. And I think the most important thing they did here was not just to get the technology, but they really got their ducks in a row when it came to the people and process sides of this as well. So by bringing all those folks together to talk about how equity and how that intersects with recruitment and their recruitment strategy, they were able to have a little bit more of a cultural shift in which they also thought about, okay, it's not just okay for us to recruit more of these individuals, but what are we going to do once they're here to support them, to make sure that this is a good experience for them as they're going back out into the community. He has to work really closely with IT to make sure that the tool he's procuring checks all the boxes, and had to make sure that they had the prospect experience mapped. So he had a very clear vision of what he wanted that experience to look like for a Latino or a Black student. What happened was he ended up using this tool. He ended up finding out a lot of things, like, for example, they needed to do the hard mail packets out to parents of students. They started doing more emails that were a mix of English as well as Spanish and things like that to reach those demographics. And what were the results? Just about a few years later, they saw a 7% increase in enrollment overall, and specifically double-digit increases in Latino students and some increases in Black students as well. We went back to them during sort of COVID times, and they were actually profiled in Forbes because they were able to, through having these mechanisms in place, they said they were outsmarting the enrollment challenges during the pandemic. I don't know if they outsmarted them, but they certainly fared a lot better than some other schools that did not have this sort of process in place to really understand who are we missing, how do we reach them, how do we cater our messages to them. We also talked a little bit to the vendor, TargetX Liaison, and we said, is this just your product? Is it more what Jay Murray is doing? And Sasha Peterson, who is the CIO at TargetX Liaison, told us, credit where credit is due. You can use this tool to just increase enrollment generally. You can use this tool and it might not work at all, but it's really about having someone there who can drive the vision, who can say, let's really think about what we mean by access and who it's for. And that's a really important message to take home too about admissions. So with that, we're on a kind of our final strategy, which is to check your tools. So as we discussed, next-gen recruitment includes understanding really the whole student and prospect, generating messaging that highlights the things that they will value. And tech can be useful in bringing those two ideas together. And this is the big if it is implemented well and at scale. And to implement well, there's a lot of resources from the ADA Center that I can pass along to you all to help with that. But the big questions are really thinking first about the institution processes to amend or engage with to improve the enrollment strategy. So having your vision first before laying the technology on top. Really doing your research on the tools you currently have before necessarily going out and buying something new. And when you do go out to buy something new, really having a clear and crisp idea of what specific features you need so you can ask about them. Thinking about the data that you want to inform your efforts. So what kind of data do we want to collect besides just male and female? Like, what do we want to know about our female students? What do we want to know about our male students? How might we go about doing that? And then what people, as we connect admissions and recruitment to other parts of the institution, will be needed to help inform and update our strategy. The ADA Center does a couple of activities when we work with schools and when we work with state systems where we will help to map the prospect and student communication system. Sometimes we'll do technology ecosystem mapping to figure out what are the gaps in the tech ecosystem as you're thinking about a strategy. You don't necessarily need us to do those things. There's a lot of resources online. We just kind of work with folks who need they want a little bit more help as they're going through that process. But I will link out to those resources as well. Okay, so we have come to the end. There's a couple of the recommended resources I have for you all. I talked a little bit, about some of the messaging research we did and like what messages work and what messages don't. There's a little bit more sort of granularity about the do's and don'ts of messaging on the Aspen Institute website, where I've published some of those things. Of course, the Workforce Playbook, if you're interested in CTE as a whole. I'd also recommend, if you're interested in technology and how technology can support executing on some of your next gen strategies, the Advising Technology, Procurement and Planning playbook, which was my latest research, that has everything from how to think about an RFP to sort of a cheat sheet of questions to ask vendors if you're looking at CRMs and that kind of thing. So this kind of brings us to the end, but just wanted to give a shout out to all of you here and to NET. We know that stronger and more inclusive pipelines are absolutely an imperative. I know that it is on the NET website, but just to reiterate that from my own research perspective, there's a quote from a hiring manager at Toyota who said, we need more people in general, and we know it's not a great strategy if our field is excluding 50% of the population. And then our female welding student who said, the guys in class take me more seriously now, they see what I can do. I'm great at what I do and they know it. So thank you for all that you do to help us get more students into these high demand, high wage careers, to expose them to more things and to advocate for equity across the board. So thank you. With that, I'll open the floor for questions.
Wow, Brittany, you gave us such wonderful and rich resources and a lot to think about. And now we are opening it to discussions. So please unmute yourself or raise your hand. Tell us that you would like to ask a question. If you are shy, you would like to include it in the chat, please do so. But now it's your time to ask questions and to interact with our distinguished speaker. But while you're getting your thoughts and your questions together, I had a question actually for Brittany about outreach to students who are hard to reach or difficult to reach. They may not be engaged at all. And so let's talking about unemployed students, or maybe students who are new to this country, immigrant students. How do you have any strategies or tools that you can suggest for administrators or admission professionals to reach those students and message to them who may not be really engaged or connected to systems of education?
Absolutely. So it is true that they're not necessarily connected to us, right, in higher education, but generally they are connected to something in the community, right? And so what I've seen a lot of colleges do, so for example, in the Valencia example, first they had to understand who these people were. So they did their data analysis. They understood that there were unemployed and underemployed folks out there. From there, it was about going out into the community and figuring out, well, if they're not here, then where are they? And so they had a few folks who actually realized that some of them were at the religious organizations in the community. And several of them realized that these are people who are just lower income workers, the very bottom rung of employment at employers around the community, right? So these are folks who are working at McDonald's, folks who are working the lowest rungs of construction, things like that. And so they were able to actually work with some of the employers in the community as well to say, how can we help to upskill the folks that you also currently have and move them up the ladder? And the benefit of that was that not only are you reaching those people, but you're also, strengthening your relationships with your employers and allowing your employers to become co-recruiters with you as well. So that's something that we talk about a lot, because a lot of times employers will come to CTE program heads or to faculty and say, hey, I need workers for XYZ, and they want you to be able to deliver. And what we tell a lot of our CTE leaders is that you also have the power to go back to the employer and say, well, if you want workers, here's how you need to help me with recruitment as well. And here's how we need to make sure that we're communicating with the community. So employers are one, I would say CBOs and community-based organizations are another. And so really making sure that your community college is of the community and therefore connected to community organizations is where folks have had a lot of success with that.
Great, thank you, Brittany. Any questions for Brittany? Please unmute yourself and ask. It's a great opportunity to have Brittany with us today, and it's your chance. Ruben, go ahead.
Hello, hi. Firstly, thank you for organizing this. This is definitely a great opportunity for me, and Also, I have one question. Firstly, I wanted to know, is there any way the presentation will be available?
Yes.
The actual PowerPoint, because I tried to take some screenshots. There was some great information on there, particularly around the stuff with CRM, because in my experience, as you mentioned, it's always sort of fragmented. You know, there's one platform that may be great for, you know, maybe the recruitment piece, but you need a different platform for the case management piece. And, you know, in collaboration with other, like I work in CUNY, and, you know, the central office may use one set of programs, whereas the campus may use another set, and me on my own, I may use a different thing.
Yeah.
And so that can be challenging at times, but I'm curious, is there a program or a system that you would recommend for just general project management? Like sort of for a program for the, like kind of looking at the overall, like for instance, let's say I'm working on a year-long plan for how I plan on engaging students. Is there a program that's really good for getting the bigger picture?
I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily a specific technology. Are you trying just like kind of project management planning personally?
Yep.
I've seen folks use a ton of different stuff. So if you a subscription model, you know, I've seen folks who use Basecamp pretty effectively and other things like that. There are folks who will use Teams. I don't think that need is super. I would just kind of shop around and talk to some of your colleagues who are doing it, because that technology is not super complex. It's just a matter of preference, I find, with most people. Like, how do you like to organize your stuff? Certainly people have used some of the Post-it, the sticky things to do it. Some people use OneNote. Some people will use the Google Suites for it. I don't know that there's one that's necessarily better than another that I would necessarily recommend. It's just a matter of personal preference and maybe what's going to integrate with the other tools you have. So if your school is a Teams school, certainly some of the Teams products can work well. If your school is more on the Google Suite, sometimes folks will use that a little bit more. So I would just say, like, maybe don't try to reinvent wheels, see what'll go with what you already have. But beyond that, I don't know if there's one that's astronomically better.
Thank you.
And on the question of whether the slides will be available, the entire webinar was recorded and it will be uploaded to the NET website at www.netprogram.org. And so, Ruben, you bring up a really good point, and I was really intrigued by the system mapping and wanted to ask Brittany to explore more with us what that entails. Is it a mapping of the process? Is it a mapping of the assets that you have? What does it entail?
So we have an explanation of the full process that we typically go through with the ADA Center. So we'll, I promised my partner I wouldn't talk too much about this because I think we're booked up with people to the end of the year. But what we'll typically do, and you can also do this on your own if you would like to, is you map out across the student journey, what are the main initiatives that you have going on, from recruitment through retention. And we usually use, if you're familiar with the guided pathways framework, we'll oftentimes use that as a guiding framework for it. What are your initiatives? Put that map aside, you take out a separate map and you say, okay, for each of those initiatives, what are the technologies that we have in place to support those things? And it'll usually be a really long list. And there's usually two things that people see when they do that map. They will see that they have technologies that are serving duplicative functions. So they might say, for example, if one of our things is under student recruitment, we have recruitment events and student outreach. They might have both somebody who's using an Excel document to keep track of things. They might use Outlook for emails, and they might also use some kind of texting mechanism for a specific program. So they'll see overlapping technologies, and they will also see technology gaps. So they'll see places where they're like, oh gosh, we don't actually have a tool that keeps track of all of our notes about students. We have folks kind of draw those out. We usually do this over kind of a 2-hour process, where that includes people from across the institution. So different people with different perspectives on the technologies being used. From there, we reflect on what were the gaps in technologies and what are the overlaps in technologies. And then from there, we typically do interviews with each of the departments at an institution. to understand what their goals are and how they're currently using technology, what their frustrations are, what's going well, and then come up with a list of recommendations. But certainly there are people who work in IT or in student success who can kind of do those interviews on their own as well and come back with an IT plan. If you want to explore more about how to do that, that's certainly on our ADA Center website. So I can shoot that over as well. We also have, the other big research project that we just did was this one, the Advising Technology Procurement Playbook, which kind of talks you through step by step how to approach creating a technology strategy that allows your institution to be a little bit less disconnected and having technology align with rather than completely impede your strategies.
Right, and definitely the wise words that you shared at the beginning, that technology is a tool. It's not really the be all or end all. It's just facilitative tool. Any questions? I'll pause here and see if Ruben and Amy, Alex, Ellie, any questions? It's a wonderfully small group and lends itself to further discussion, in-depth discussions. So please don't be shy. Go ahead, Ruben.
I'm sorry, I have more questions, but I just want to give you a context for my program. So specifically, my program is called NYC Men Teach, and I work with men who are seeking to become teachers in the Department of Education. But as far as Perkins at being we have a larger team of people who work towards supporting folks who are doing non-traditional programs. But I'm curious about what you may sort of insight you would give for a program like mine, where I'm looking for ECE students. I find many students who are many students who are interested in education, not specifically ECE, but they're interested in, like early childhood, bilingual, but specifically for early, so not early childhood, bilingual, sometimes even college. But for students who are specifically into ECE, what sort of recommendations would you give, or best practices to consider as far as just being support, different kinds of program engagement? And I'm asking very generally because I'm sure you'll have different insight to offer as per your research. And I have different things that I've done, but I'm just curious to hear what you would say.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked to, I feel like we did some work in North Carolina on this, because they had a situation where in some of the more rural areas, they just didn't have enough people to do early childhood education. And so I can speak to kind of what they have done, but I'd be curious to hear too, like what's been working for you and how that's been going. But what they did is they really invested in some of the K-12 pipelines into early childhood education, and worked with the local four-year institution to think about pathways that take them through early childhood education, but then also might map to a transfer degree for a bachelor's degree later on after they got some experience. And that was appealing for a lot of folks to think about getting basically money and scholarships to continue their education later on, and what made that pathway a little bit more appealing for them. And that was really impactful, as well as the fact that you were getting to them a little bit earlier on. So getting to them, I think, as early as like 9th grade, and starting to talk to them about some of those career options, since opinions tend to form pretty early. I'd be curious to hear more about like what you've done as well. But I think for early childhood, that's one of the ones where folks talk a lot about, like when we talk about the messaging about outcomes, right? We say some of the most effective messaging is around, you're going to move up the economic ladder and have good wages. And we know that that's not necessarily true for all jobs. And we know that that doesn't mean that those jobs aren't still really, really important, right? And so the other thing that we advise for some of those types of roles, like early childhood, is one, being able to emphasize the other benefits of being in that role, in that job, and whatever it might be. So is it a scholarship to go transfer, to get a bachelor's degree? Is it being able to help people, whatever those program attributes are, but also being honest about what some of the outcomes are as well, because you don't want people joining that career path and then dropping immediately situations. So
Thank you. Well, what I can think of is primarily sort of the advertising of the program NYC Men Teach as a Village, and highlighting the pipeline. So students know that from the time that they enter a two-year college all the way up until the point that they're working at a New York City public school, they will have different kinds of supports. There will be people who are there along the journey with you to sort of help you, because we give data to show that oftentimes in that first year of teaching, a lot of male teachers usually leave. But when they have different kinds of support, namely other male teachers who've been through the experience and who've made it past the first year, it makes a difference, because sometimes being the sole man in a classroom with all children can be a little bit daunting. The expectations, so some of the misnomers around, you know, what masculinity looks like in those spaces, all those things can be challenging. So having conversations where students or teachers who have already been in those roles kind of just, you know, give their experience, I feel like that's been useful. But I think something that we could do more of is include people who would be prospective teachers, not necessarily just students who are engaged in the program.
Yeah, like have a mentorship program or something like that. I've seen where you know, you can do a shadow for a day at a K-12. You know, have like a 9th grader, 10th grader shadow one of your male teachers for a day or something like that.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. Yeah.
If they're interested in it, because I think that's the earlier the better, because we start forming so many of those stereotypes and opinions so early. So that we connect with some like cool 20-something who's in the classroom, who's male, who's like me as a mentor, can be really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. That sounds like an amazing. I'm gonna have to Google you a little bit later. That's so cool.
Right,
It's a very, very cool thing. Yeah.
So Brittany, speaking of outcomes, you know, many of the institutions that are in the Perkins network track completion, but not job placements. And so wanted to hear your perspective on, you know, obviously tracking all your graduates to see where they're landing is difficult, but shouldn't that be the outcome that we are tracking instead of just completing the program? Because as you said, many of the programs may not lead to immediately to job placement. But shouldn't we be tracking job placement as an outcome instead of completion?
Yes, that is, I feel like a leading question. Yes, so the answer is yes, absolutely we should. There's a difference between should and able, I think. And so yes, absolutely 100%, we need to be able to be tracking outcomes, because that is what our students are interested in. And that is also how we know if our programs are aligned with the demands of the labor market, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to be pumping, you know, 50 graduates out into a labor market that's hiring 2. You know, it's great for employers, they get their choice, but not great for our students. But it is really difficult to do in practice because Burning Glass and MZ, I think one of them acquired the other, is kind of the preeminent labor market data provider. A lot of folks think Monroe Community College actually has a great database and a great like visual display too of labor market demands and kind of average salary and wages for various careers by region. And it's actually, it's in, I think the link to it is in the workforce playbook, but I think if you can Google that region, the Rochester region, they've got a great display of labor market data that might be applicable for some of the rest of you here. However, that's just sort of on the average. So how much does a nurse make in general here? How much does a welder make in general here? It's not your student, we don't know about their placement, but it is a start. So I'd say like starting with the labor market statistics that are available for your different job roles, and the more specific you can get, the better. Great. Then comes to our specific students. How do we track their outcomes? Burning Glass and MZ and some of these other tech companies will...
Burning Glass, I'm sorry? Burning
Glass and MZ are the two. I think Burning Glass might have acquired, no, MZ might have acquired Burning Glass. So MZ, EMSI. will sometimes market, and I know that they've been working on some AI and other tech that can crawl LinkedIn and crawl these other sites to find out where folks are. That doesn't work that well for CTE students, right? Because they're not the primary users of things like LinkedIn, which is the database that uses. So what I've seen folks do is one of the more effective methods is to do that surveying of your students as they are graduating. So one of the schools, so in North Dakota, one of the things the CTE programs do is they talk to students about, when you graduate, we are going to give you a blue slip. This blue slip is going to ask you several questions. One, it's where are you going to work, if you know. Two, like, if you're comfortable, like, what's the salary range that you're earning? What's your title? Three very, very simple questions. They talk to them at orientation about the importance of collecting those blue slips when they graduate, because they're like, hey, new students, it helped you out when our alumni told you how they were doing in the job market. Pay it forward. When you graduate, make sure you fill out your blue slip. And they get to graduation and they go to pick up and register for graduation. Part of what they're asked to do is to turn in their blue slip. So you're getting them when they're still with you, right? Now, granted, not all of them are going to have jobs on graduation day, so you won't get all of that data.
Yeah.
But at least you will have some of it. And for the rest of it, I think the blue slips also included some contact information. So if you have a CRM or something like that, you can follow up with those who did not submit the information yet. That is one strategy I've seen work really well, the school that had that data. Another one kind of did it at the program level. And so for most CTE programs, a lot of times faculty are of that industry, that field, have connections with employers in that field. And so they will speak to their major employers who they know hire their students to get information about, hey, have you hired any of these students? If so, like, what's the general range of their salary, if you're willing to share? And so getting the information directly from your employer partners can also work. Those are two. There's no easy answer. Unfortunately, I would love to be able to say that there's just this database that's magic in the United States that allows us to do those things, but unfortunately, not yet. But those practices can help to at least get some partial information.
Right. You don't think that alumni associations and mechanisms of like that work, keeping in touch with your students after they graduate at all?
Sorry, what?
Alumni associations or organizations that focus on some kind of organizing among the students who graduated. Do you see that as a strategy that might work?
Can help. I would say that what I've seen anecdotally, and I'll say that this is not stuff that I've done specific research on, but anecdotally, I know that the folks who had more data on program outcomes relied less on a general alumni association and actually relied a little bit more on stuff that was a little bit more program specific. So a lead faculty member or someone that the students know.
Yeah.
The research on this is that students are more likely to open an email from a faculty member from their program that they met at some point than an email from an alumni association person that they don't recognize.
True. That's very true. Well, thank you so much, Brittany.
Sure.
Any final questions?
Alex said, how do you envision the duration of a candidate can be tracked for employment or is to consider it a success? I mean, it's kind of an it depends question, I think, depending on the field a little bit. So actually, let me see if I can pull up this slide. I say depending on the field because certain jobs and careers have, you're hired and there's a pretty clear kind of step wage progression. And so you can assume once somebody is employed and has been employed for, has been employed within that 1 year of graduating, you've done your due diligence to say, we know that our students get employment and we know they're earning X wage, a year out. The exception to that, and let me see if I can find this slide, would be for jobs where it takes a few years for students to see the payback of their degree. And so let me see if I can share this. One of the things Monroe did, one of your own New Yorkers, if you can see that. So they started tracking for mechanical engineering technologies. This data is a little bit old. But one of the things that was important here was that when students first graduate year one, they're actually earning below what they could earn at an entry-level job in Rochester. Okay, so like the average workforce wages for an entry-level wage was 16. Year one, they're earning 12. That's not great for a student. And if the student graduates and didn't know about this trajectory, they're not going to feel great about that. So what Monroe does is they make sure they have a conversation with the student that says, look, year one, you're sort of still an apprentice. You're not going to make as much. However, if you stay 3 years in that role, your trajectory is going to put you kind of solidly in the middle class. You're actually going to be earning, way more than you would at an entry-level job. And if you continue to year 4 and beyond, now you're actually a high wage earner, right? However, you have to know that if you follow this program, you're going to have to stick with your employment in order to become in that sort of like 90th percentile of earnings. Okay. So just for context, this line is not showing that everyone in this program earns less than everyone in the community. This is just showing that this is the average entry-level wage in that county for entry-level, median, and high wage. And that includes stuff like some of your more professional degrees as well, right? So it's going to be a little bit higher. What we do see is that after 3 years, you are doing much better off than if you had not attended that program. At 4 years, you're doing way, way better off than you would have had you not gone to that program. However, important to let our students know that, important to track that, because we don't want a sort of Susan situation where I come out of my program and I think I wasted my time and my money.
Yeah, it's very problematic when a student invests this time and resources and not find a job that they thought they'd have. So for sure, tracking that data is very important. All right, we're coming to the end of time, but we can take another final question if anybody has one.
Can I take it? Oh,
Esther, go ahead.
oh, actually, my question is similar. I guess like the first thing that I would say, like, you mentioned the importance of like this transparency, on the program outcomes, or like what students expect after graduation. Although I think every student have like a different goals, they have like a different interest and different like outcome that they hope to get from, or like by completing the program. So I think it would be really like, it would be difficult to really, difficult to really understand or get that data, or like really understand, or like trying to attempt to, tackle their needs. So I think when crafting the message, seems like the idea of using the effective language is important, and I guess in your research, I know that the group were divided into like a 3 group, like which were opportunity youth, underrepresented, and like unemployed adults. Right? Yeah.
Unemployed.
Oh, yes. Sorry. I wonder if there's like, maybe I kind of want to get more like into this. I want to read more on this, but like whether there were like some of the words that you learn that we should avoid when like crafting message to really, encourage this population to, pursue more like, this kind of like, you know what I mean? Like this kind of program.
Like are there other like do's and don'ts of messaging? I see that like Eli had a similar question. Yes, a lot of that is in the, I don't know if we're gonna have time to get into it today, but there are other resources. And I'd say there's a pretty extensive list of like, do this, not that, on that website. But for example, there are things like folks being overly familiar with students and overly like kind of chatty students today, like saying like, I know you, like you will enjoy this, like, hello, Esther, and being super, super familiar and using, the newest slang of the day. And students, particularly Gen Z, have a little bit of an aversion to that because they are wary about privacy issues. And when you seem overly familiar and they don't know you, it is a big kind of turnoff for them. So certainly there are do's and don'ts. I'd encourage you to explore those in the research. There's also research on things like certain students respond better to the word job versus career. Younger students tend to, like if they're looking for a career, that's more of your opportunity. Youth, you know, they're aspirational. They're looking for their first leg up on the ladder. We found that more of your older adults kind of liked the idea of the word jobs, and new skills was a really popular one that popped with them because they, you know, some of them are 40, 50 years old. They're not necessarily looking for a new career. They want new skills to help them on their current path. So things like that, like new skills as a phrase to answer Eli's question was another one that tended to pop with folks. But it really depends. It really depends on who your who is. And that's, so I'll go back to that. So really understanding the data of it, and then using your data to actually go out and do your own focus groups and to talk to people and to maybe, you know, you can copy the exercise that we did with our messaging and have them do the highlighting, have them do the crossouts, and find out what words kind of work for you.
Right. Excellent answers. Thank you. Okay. With that, I'd like to extend our heartfelt thank you to Brittany. This has been a wonderful, phenomenal presentation and discussion. Thank you again so much for introducing us to your research and your findings and the resources that you are creating for our communities. We are definitely going to link these resources on the NET website as well. But again, thank you again so very much. We appreciate you, and please continue to do the good work that you're doing. And for everybody else, thank you. And please stay tuned. The webinar's recording will be uploaded on the NET website, and see you next webinar. Thank you again so much. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.